Throughout the 1920s, the Soviet Union, led by its megalomaniac leader Joseph Stalin, embarked on several programs to launch the USSR into industrialization or cleanse its population of those deemed undesirable. The first five-year plan began in 1928 and aimed to move the country away from its agricultural roots to become a fully fledged industrial powerhouse, with mixed results to put it nicely. But around the same time, another program began, designed to effectively wipe out an entire class within the Soviet Union. Dekulakization is a modern term coined to describe the horrors of what happened between 1929 and 1933, in which nearly 500,000 kulaks, land-owning peasants, died after being forced into deportation to distant, often hellish areas of the Soviet Union. It's thought that as many as 6 million kulaks were forced to move during this period. Even those who didn't find themselves in a gulag in Siberia were driven from their lands and dispersed across the USSR. Stalin wanted to eradicate this class of people either through execution, confinement, disease, or simply diluting them into the vast cauldron that was the Soviet Union. The 1920s were a tumultuous decade for the Soviet Union, with countless political, economic, and social changes. After the conclusion of the Russian Civil War, the early Soviet regime faced immense challenges, including economic devastation, widespread famine, and international isolation. Lenin's leadership came to an abrupt end when he suffered a series of strokes in 1922 and 1923, leading to his death in January 1924. Joseph Stalin, appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922, was not initially seen as a likely successor to Lenin, but managed to build a base of support within the party by appointing allies to key positions and carefully managing the party machinery. By the mid-1920s, Stalin had effectively outmaneuvered his rivals through strategic alliances and plenty of political backstabbing. The united opposition, formed by Trotsky, Kamenev, and Zinoviev to counter Stalin's growing power, failed to gain any significant traction. By 1927, Trotsky was expelled from the Communist Party and subsequently exiled, removing the last substantial obstacle to Stalin's consolidation of power. The Soviet Union was now in the hands of a man who had been little more than a thug for most of his life. Gone was Lenin's idealism, gone was Trotsky's intellectual capacity. The man at the reins, who was brutal, paranoid, and capable of absolutely anything. Over time, Stalin's withering suspicion and hatred would be a death sentence for millions across the Soviet Union. However, before the Red Terror and the purges that saw the Communist Party devour most of its young, one of the first groups drawn into the firing line was the Kulaks. The term kulak originated from the Russian word for fist, often implying someone who was tight-fisted or miserly, but historically kulaks were simply peasants who owned more land and livestock than their neighbors. They emerged as a distinct class during the 19th century, particularly after the Emancipation Reform of 1861, which abolished serfdom in Russia. The reform granted peasants personal freedom and the right to buy land from the landlords. Those who managed to accumulate wealth and resources became known as kulaks. These were not aristocratic fat cats leeching off of the poor. They were simply peasants who had done well for themselves. As the Russian agricultural sector slowly modernized, the kulaks began to prosper by taking advantage of new agricultural practices, lending money and leasing additional land. By the early 20th century, they were a significant force in the rural economy, often hiring fellow villagers for seasonal work and playing essential roles in local agriculture markets and community life. Following the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, the new Soviet government initially tolerated the kulaks as it needed their agricultural expertise and output to feed the population and stabilize the economy. However, the relationship between the state and the kulaks was tense. The kulaks' ability to hire labor put them at odds with the Bolshevik socialist ideology, which favored a classless society and viewed them as potential class enemies. The situation escalated during the Russian Civil War when the Bolsheviks implemented war communism, including requisitioning grain from peasants to feed the urban population and the Red Army. The kulaks resisted these policies, which often led to violent confrontations. The introduction of the new economic policy in 1921 temporarily eased these tensions by allowing some private trade and small-scale manufacturing, which benefited the kulaks and allowed them to thrive again. However, Stalin was inherently suspicious of the kulaks, viewing them as hindering socialist transformation. He believed that the state needed to control agriculture to finance industrialization, ensure food security, and eliminate the kulaks as a class whom he increasingly portrayed as exploiters and enemies of socialism. Stalin pushed for rapid collectivization of agriculture starting in 1929, aiming to consolidate individual land and labor into collective farms, kolkhozes, and state farms, sovkhozes. The policy was designed not only to build a more robust Soviet Union, but also to break the Kulaks' grip on small-scale farming and eventually destroy them. The groundwork for dekulakization was laid in the years before the full-scale collectivization drive. During this period, the Soviet leadership publicly identified the Kulaks as a significant impediment to the socialist transformation of agriculture. The regime's rhetoric intensified, depicting the Kulaks as exploiters of the poor peasantry and hoarders of grain to sabotage the state's efforts to secure food supplies. Propaganda inflamed tensions, painting the Kulaks as bloodthirsty leeches, preying on the blood of the hardworking men and women of the Soviet Union. In 1929, Stalin made a decisive move towards collectivization, marked by the official policy to liquidate the Kulaks as a class. The party agreed to this policy in January 1930, setting in motion the widespread confiscation of land, livestock, and other properties from Kulak families. The Central Committee of the Communist Party directed local officials to categorize Kulaks into 3 groups ostensibly based on the severity of their offenses against the collective state. Category 1 was enemies of the people. Kulaks in the first category were labeled as the most hostile and dangerous to the goals of collectivization. This category included those who actively resisted Soviet policies, such as organizing uprisings, sabotaging farm equipment, burning state-owned buildings, or inciting others to rebel. Individuals in this group were subject to the harshest penalties, including immediate arrest, trial and execution, or long-term imprisonment in labor camps. Category 2 was deportees. The second category comprised Kulaks considered less actively hostile, but still a threat due to their potential to undermine the state's policies. This group was subject to deportation to remote regions such as Siberia, the Urals, or Kazakhstan. Families classified under this category were forcibly removed from their homes and sent to special settlements where they were often used as forced labor. The conditions in these areas were extremely harsh, and many deportees died from cold, starvation, or disease due to inadequate shelter, food, and medical care. This category affected the largest number of people, dramatically altering the demographic composition of entire regions. And Category 3 was the displaced. Kulaks classified into this third category were those whose actions were deemed obstructive but not overtly hostile. These included individuals who had engaged in lesser resistance, such as hiding food or refusing to surrender grain quotas. Members of this group were not deported but were subjected to internal exile within their own regions. They were relocated to other areas, often desolate or marginal lands, where they were banned from joining collective farms and denied the right to lease land or engage in trade. This effectively stripped them of their means of subsistence and was intended to reduce their influence in the local community. The criteria for classifying Kulaks were dubious and highly subjective, leading to widespread abuses of power. Local officials often exploited the classification system to settle personal vendettas or to seize property. Allegations sufficient for classification could come from neighbors, local activists, or even family members, and the verification process was minimal, if not non-existent. As was the case later in the Soviet Union, a single negative word said by a begrudging neighbor or acquaintance could easily be a death sentence. The years 1930 and 1931 saw the peak of the Dekulakization campaign. Massive propaganda efforts were ramped up to portray the Kulaks as enemies of the state, used to justify their harsh treatment to the Soviet public. Posters, pamphlets, and newspaper articles depicted Kulaks as greedy, malicious, and counter-revolutionary, creating an atmosphere of fear and mistrust that pitted communities against each other. During this period, the state mobilized local party cells, the NKVD, secret police, and poor peasants to implement the policy. Approximately 1.8 million people were deported in these 2 years alone. The operations were often violent, with families being forcibly removed from their homes, often in the dead of winter, and transported in inhumane conditions to their destinations, or where their survival was uncertain. As collectivization disrupted agricultural productivity, it contributed to one of the most devastating famines in Soviet history, known as the Holodomor in Ukraine, where millions perished. The state's response to the famine often involved increased repression as it continued to blame the Kulaks for hoarding and sabotage. Between 1931 and 1933, the scope of dekulakization expanded, with more individuals categorized and targeted as kulaks merely for resisting collectivization or for trying to hide food to feed their families. During the dekulakization periods, the NKVD, the secret police, played a pivotal and often brutal role, tasked with identifying, categorizing, and dealing with kulaks according to the classifications set by the Communist Party. The NKVD was granted extraordinary powers to arrest kulaks deemed enemies of the state, Category 1. Once arrested, kulaks faced brutal interrogations designed to extract confessions, real or coerced, which were used to justify severe punishments or executions. These operations were carried out with ruthless efficiency, often without due process, and executions were carried out swiftly to instill a climate of fear and compliance among the peasantry. The logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of people across vast distances into exile were complex and required precise coordination. The NKVD oversaw the entire process, from rounding up families to arranging the trains for their long and harsh journeys. The conditions of these transports were notoriously inhumane, overcrowded, and undersupplied. Many deportees did not survive the journey. Beyond physical enforcement, the NKVD was the Soviet Union's eyes and ears. This included infiltrating peasant communities with informants who could report any anti-Soviet sentiments or a resistance to collectivization. The mere presence of the NKVD and its network of informants created an atmosphere of mistrust among rural communities, effectively stifling resistance and consolidating the state's control over the countryside. The arrest and execution of Kulak parents often left their children orphaned and alone. Many of these children, some very young, were left to fend for themselves in hostile environments, lacking food, shelter, and protection. In cases of deportation, children were sometimes separated from their parents, either during the chaotic rounding up process or as part of a deliberate strategy to break Kulak family ties and loyalties. As families were herded onto trains into distant labor camps or exile villages, the confusion and harsh conditions often led to further separations. Children who were orphaned or separate from their parents during deportations were frequently placed in state-run orphanages or special homes for the children of enemies of the people. These institutions were often underfunded and overcrowded with minimal education or emotional support provisions. The Soviet regime viewed these children not just as victims needing care, but as potential threats needing re-education. The aim was to indoctrinate them with socialist values and ease any lingering loyalty to their Kulak heritage, effectively transforming them into loyal Soviet citizens. Children were taught to reject their Kulak backgrounds and to embrace the ideals of the Soviet state. The curriculum stigmatized their identities, often teaching them that their parents were enemies of the state. This indoctrination was aimed at cultivating a new generation that would contribute to the building of socialism without the baggage of their parents' supposed counter-revolutionary actions. For those children who remained with their families during deportation to remote regions, life was incredibly harsh. They faced extreme cold, inadequate shelter, and chronic food shortages. Many were forced into labor from a young age to help their families survive in these desolate conditions. The psychological and physical toll of such a life was immense, with many suffering from malnutrition, disease, and emotional trauma. The long-term impact on children affected by this process was horrendous. The psychological impact of such early trauma, combined with systemic indoctrination and stigmatization, shaped a generation whose experiences would influence the course of Soviet society. The human cost of dekulakization was staggering. Estimates of those affected vary wildly, with millions deported, hundreds of thousands executed, and countless more dying from exposure, starvation, or the harsh conditions of their exile. The policy also disastrously affected agricultural productivity, leading to widespread famine. For years, the agricultural sector suffered from inefficiency and low productivity due to dekulakization, undermining the Soviet government's efforts to modernize the economy. The disruption badly weakened the rural economy, leading to food shortages and a reliance on imports which strained the Soviet Union's financial resources. What happened to the Kulaks obliterated the social fabric of the Soviet countryside. The fear and distrust sown among neighbors, encouraged to denounce each other, to curry favor with authorities, fractured traditional village solidarity and cooperation, which had been a cornerstone of rural life. The policy also had a profound demographic impact. The displacement of millions of people through deportations and resettlements changed the ethnic and social makeup of many regions, with long-lasting effects on community cohesion and identity. The trauma experienced by displaced families and children who grew up in harsh conditions with little or no parental support contributed to a generation characterized by deep psychological scars. Politically, dekulakization served as a brutal demonstration of the power of the Stalinist state and a warning to any who might consider opposing Soviet authority. The campaign helped consolidate Stalin's control over the Communist Party and the Soviet state by instilling fear and demonstrating his willingness to use ruthless measures against perceived enemies. And yet, this was just the start in the Soviet Union. Stalin's purges would soon tear through the USSR as his paranoia shifted into an even higher gear. Dekulakization is rarely spoken about in Russia today, where a Stalin resurgence has sought to downplay anything negative said about the great Soviet leader. But the facts don't lie, even if the exact figures are unknown. In the years that followed, as another psychopath to the West unraveled his own murderous plan, we were introduced to the word genocide, meaning to deliberately destroy an entire race. In the Soviet Union, it wasn't a race Stalin wanted to eliminate, it was a specific class. This was classicide on a grand and horrendous scale.